Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a world that no longer exists, shattered into fragments and swallowed by the hungering void between reality and nightmare, and yet it refuses to die. Its name was Cadian, and though the planet itself has been broken apart, ground into dust and stolen away by forces older and more terrible than anything the human mind was ever meant to comprehend, the spirit of that world burns on. It burns in the hearts of its scattered children. It burns in the eyes of soldiers who march under banners they will never again see raised above its fortress walls. It burns in a single phrase shouted across 1,000,000 battlefields in every corner of a galaxy drowning in war. Cadian stands. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with these soldiers. We are going to walk alongside them through the history of their world, from the strange and ancient days before humanity ever set foot upon its soil, us through 10,000 years of war against the most horrifying forces the galaxy has ever produced, all the way to the cataclysmic moment when the ground itself betrayed them and the sky tore open like a wound that would never heal. This is the story of the Cadian shock troops, the finest soldiers the Imperium of man has ever produced. And I want you to settle in, because we have a great deal to talk about. Let us begin at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as we can find in a universe where history stretches back millions upon millions of years, and the truth is buried beneath layers of legend, propaganda, and deliberate obfuscation. Cadian was a terrestrial world, roughly similar to ancient Terra in terms of its basic characteristics. It possessed breathable atmosphere, liquid water, temperate zones capable of supporting human life, and a gravitational pull that would have felt familiar to anyone born on the homeworld of our species. In most respects, it was unremarkable, a rocky ball of minerals and silicates orbiting a yellow star in the segmentum obscurus, one of the 5 great divisions of the galaxy, as the Imperium reckons such things. But there was nothing unremarkable about where Cadian sat. Not at all. Because Cadian occupied what might be the single most dangerous piece of real estate in the entire Milky Way galaxy, and it sat at the mouth of a narrow corridor of relatively stable space known as the Cadian Gate. And that corridor was the only reliable passage large enough for battle fleets to travel between the galaxy proper and the nightmare realm known as the Eye of Terror. Now, if you are not familiar with the Eye of Terror, allow me to paint you a picture. Imagine a wound in the fabric of existence itself. Not a wound in flesh or stone or metal, but a wound in reality, as a place where the barrier between the material universe and the seething, formless dimension called the warp has been torn asunder. The Eye of Terror is enormous, spanning thousands of light years across, a churning maelstrom of impossible energies, where the laws of physics hold no authority, and where the demonic entities that dwell within the warp can manifest in something approaching physical form. It was created in a single catastrophic instant, millions of years before humans ever evolved, are born from the psychic death scream of an entire alien civilization, the Aeldari, whose decadence and excess gave birth to a new god of chaos, so terrible that its emergence ripped a hole in the universe that has never healed. And Cadian sat right on the doorstep of this abomination, right there, on the very edge of damnation. The Cadian Gate was the funnel through which every major incursion of chaos forces had to pass if they wanted to assault the broader Imperium in any meaningful strength. On other routes out of the Eye existed, scattered and unreliable warp passages that smaller raiding forces might exploit. But for any fleet-scale invasion, the Cadian Gate was the only viable option. This singular geographic reality defined everything about Cadian. It defined the world's culture, its politics, its economy, its architecture, its population, and above all, it defined the character of the men and women who called it home, for 10,000 standard years. As if from the time the Imperium first recognized the strategic importance of the Cadian Gate, all the way until the world's destruction, Cadian served as humanity's shield against the darkness. It was the lock on the door, the cork in the bottle, the thin line of steel and faith that stood between the Imperium and an ocean of damnation. Every man, woman, and child on Cadia understood this truth from the moment they drew their first breath. There was no hiding from it. There was no pretending it away. Yet you could not grow up on Cadia without understanding, in the deepest and most visceral way possible, that the forces of damnation were right there, just beyond the sky, pressing against the walls of reality with patient, hungry malice. This understanding shaped the Cadians into something unique among the trillions of humans scattered across the Imperium. They became a people for whom war was not an aberration or an interruption to normal life, but was normal life itself. At the birth rate and the recruitment rate on Cadia were, for all practical purposes, the same number. Every child born on Cadia was born into the military, not in a figurative or metaphorical sense, but literally. The entire civilization was organized around a single purpose: the production and training of soldiers capable of holding the line against the worst that chaos could throw at them. And let us be clear about what that meant. It did not merely mean that Cadia produced a lot of soldiers, though it certainly did that. It meant that every single aspect of Cadian life was structured to serve the military machine. The cities, called casas in the local dialect of Low Gothic, were designed as fortresses first and habitation centers second. Every building was constructed to double as a strongpoint. Ammunition dumps were hidden in the basements of bakeries. Gun emplacements crowned the roofs of public auditoriums. The habitation blocks were built with reinforced buttresses and windows that doubled as firing slits. Living rooms were designed to function as pillboxes in the event of an urban assault. The streets of each casa were laid out in elaborate geometric patterns that, from the air, resembled an intricate puzzle, but from ground level served as interlocking killing fields and defensible corridors that could be held against an attacker for months or even years. This was not paranoia, or this was learned wisdom, purchased at an almost inconceivable cost in blood over thousands of years. The people of Cadia had been fighting the forces of chaos for so long that defensive architecture had become second nature to them, as instinctive as breathing. They did not build their cities this way because they feared an attack might come someday. They built them this way because they knew, with absolute certainty, that an attack would come. It was not a question of if, but of when, and they intended to be ready. The population of Cadia in its final years, before the destruction wrought by the 13th Black Crusade, was approximately 850 million people. That might seem like a modest number for a planet, and by the standards of the Imperium, it was. Many hive worlds supported populations numbering in the tens or hundreds of billions. But every single one of those 850 million Cadians was, in essence, a soldier. Those who served in the frontline regiments were merely the most visible expression of a military culture that permeated every level of society. Even civilians who never left Cadia, who worked in the manufactorums, or the agricultural complexes, or the vast logistics networks that kept the military machine running, were trained fighters. They maintained their weapons proficiency. They participated in regular military exercises. They stood ready to take up arms at a moment's notice if the walls were breached and the enemy poured through. This culture of universal militarization gave the Cadian people certain distinctive characteristics that set them apart from the citizens of other imperial worlds. Cadians tended to be physically robust, their bodies hardened by a lifetime of military training and the demanding conditions of their homeworld. They moved with a disciplined economy of motion that marked them as soldiers even when they were out of uniform. They spoke in clipped, precise sentences. They maintained an almost preternatural awareness of their surroundings, their eyes constantly scanning for threats, their bodies instinctively positioning themselves in relation to available cover. Meeting a Cadian for the first time, even one who had never seen combat, was like meeting someone who had spent their entire life on a hair trigger, always ready, always alert, always aware that the next moment might bring violence and death. But there was something else that marked the children of Cadia, something visible and unmistakable: their eyes. The Cadians possessed a genetic mutation, a harmless deviation from the baseline human genome that was almost certainly caused by their world's proximity to the Eye of Terror and the subtle influence of the warp upon their biology over countless generations. Cadian eyes were violet, not blue, not grey, not any shade that might be found among the normal range of human pigmentation, but a deep, striking violet that immediately identified anyone who carried the blood of Cadia in their veins. This mutation was benign. The Imperium's geneticists had studied it extensively and confirmed that the Cadians remained fully human in every meaningful sense, but it was distinctive. In the ranks of the Astra Militarum, which is the formal name for the Imperium's vast armies, those violet eyes were instantly recognizable, and they carried with them a reputation that few other worlds could match. Because the Cadian shock troops, yet the regiments of soldiers raised from Cadia's population and sent to fight across the breadth of the Imperium, were considered by military experts throughout the galaxy to be the finest conventional soldiers humanity had ever produced. Not the most individually powerful, that distinction belonged to the genetically engineered superhuman warriors of the Space Marines. Not the most fanatically devoted, that honor went to the Sisters of Battle with their white-hot faith. But in terms of discipline, adaptability, tactical acumen, and sheer professional competence, the Cadians stood alone at the summit of military excellence. Their reputation was so formidable that countless other worlds modeled their own military forces on the Cadian example, adopting Cadian equipment, Cadian training methods, Cadian organizational structures, and Cadian tactical doctrines. In many ways, the Cadian shock troops defined what it meant to be a soldier in the 41st millennium. Now, as to understand how the Cadians achieved this status, we need to go back in time, way back. Because the story of Cadia does not begin with the Imperium of man. It does not begin with the Emperor's great crusade that unified humanity's scattered worlds under a single banner 10,000 years before the present day of the setting. It begins millions of years earlier, in a conflict between alien civilizations so ancient that even the memory of them has been ground to dust by the passage of eons. Perhaps it begins with the Necrons, and it begins with the Pylons. The Pylons were, without doubt, the most mysterious and significant feature of Cadia's landscape. They were enormous monolithic structures composed of a substance called noctilith, more commonly known as blackstone, a strange material that possesses the extraordinary ability to interact with the energies of the warp. Depending on how it is configured, blackstone can either absorb psychic energy or repel it, making it one of the most strategically important substances in the entire galaxy. There were over 5,000 intact pylons scattered across the surface of Cadia, each one rising precisely 500 meters above the ground and extending another 250 meters below the surface. An additional 2,000 to 3,000 more were estimated to exist buried entirely underground, concealed by millions of years of tectonic activity and geological change. These structures were ancient beyond human comprehension, or they had been standing on Cadia's surface for approximately 65 million standard years, predating the evolution of humanity by an almost unimaginable span of time. They were built by the Necrons, a civilization of ancient aliens who had long ago transferred their consciousnesses from biological bodies into immortal mechanical forms, and they were constructed during the Necrons' apocalyptic conflict with another ancient race called the Old Ones. A war so devastating that it reshaped the very fabric of the galaxy. The purpose of the pylons was, in the broadest sense, defensive. The Necrons possessed no psychic ability whatsoever. Their mechanical bodies were immune to the corrupting influence of the warp, but they were also incapable of wielding its power. This left them vulnerable to the psychic weapons of the Old Ones and the younger races that the Old Ones had created to serve as soldiers in the war in heaven. But the pylons were designed to counteract this vulnerability by projecting a field of anti-psychic energy that dampened the influence of the warp in the region surrounding them. Where the pylons were active, the barrier between reality and the warp was strengthened, stabilized, made harder for the chaotic energies of the Imperium to penetrate. After the war in heaven ended and the Necrons entered their long slumber, the pylons continued to function, standing as silent sentinels on a world that would not see the footsteps of intelligent beings again for millions of years. but their importance only grew with time. When the Eldari civilization collapsed in an orgy of excess and depravity that gave birth to the chaos god Slanesh, the resulting psychic cataclysm tore open the Eye of Terror. This massive warp rift should have consumed everything in its vicinity, should have swallowed dozens of star systems in a tide of unreality. But it did not. It stopped. It stopped because the pylon network on Cadian and the surrounding worlds was still functioning, still projecting its anti-psychic field, still holding the warp at bay with the patient, tireless efficiency that was the hallmark of Necron engineering. It was the pylons that created the Cadian Gate. That narrow corridor of navigable space between the Eye of Terror and the broader galaxy existed precisely because the pylon network was stabilizing reality in that region, preventing the Eye from expanding to fill it. Without the pylons, the Eye of Terror would have been larger, possibly enormously larger, and the Cadian Gate would not have existed at all. The Imperium did not understand this for thousands of years. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperium's scientific and technological priesthood, studied the pylons extensively, but could never determine their purpose. Our servitors sent into the tunnels that wound through the pylons' interiors invariably malfunctioned or disappeared entirely. Attempts to breach their surfaces failed. Attempts to scan their internal structure produced contradictory or incomprehensible results. The secret of the pylons was only finally unlocked at the very end of Cadia's existence, in the desperate final hours of the 13th Black Crusade. An archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus named Belisarius Cawl, while one of the most brilliant and controversial minds in the entire Imperium, working alongside a Necron overlord named Trazyn the Infinite, who had been present when the pylons were first constructed eons ago, managed to determine that the pylon network could be activated to its full capacity. At full power, the pylons would not merely hold the Eye of Terror in check. They could close it. They could seal the wound in reality that had been bleeding for millions of years and end the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That revelation, and the tragedy that followed it, comes later in our story. For now, what matters is that when humanity first arrived on Cadian, they found a world dotted with mysterious black monoliths that hummed with an energy they could not understand, sitting on the very edge of a screaming abyss of nightmares. And being human, they did what humans do. They settled down and got to work. The earliest human inhabitants of Cadian were not the sturdy, violet-eyed soldiers we know today. They were a primitive population of humans who had survived the Age of Strife, that long period of anarchy and isolation that preceded the founding of the Imperium, and they had fallen under the influence of the Chaos Gods. They worshipped the dark powers of the warp, while offering prayers and sacrifices to entities that had been corrupting and consuming sentient life since before the birth of the first stars. This should not be entirely surprising. Cadian sat right next to the Eye of Terror, and the influence of chaos was stronger there than almost anywhere else in the galaxy. For a primitive people with no understanding of what they were dealing with, falling into the worship of the ruinous powers was almost inevitable. Yet these original Cadian humans were encountered during the Great Crusade, the vast military campaign launched by the Emperor of Mankind to reunite humanity's scattered worlds under a single government. The Emperor's forces cleansed Cadian of its chaos-corrupted population and claimed the world for the Imperium. But the strategic importance of the Cadian Gate was not immediately appreciated. It was not until the aftermath of the First Black Crusade, launched by the Chaos Lord Abaddon the Despoiler, approximately 500 years after the end of the Horus Heresy, that the Imperium recognized the critical need to fortify Cadian and the surrounding systems. Following that first devastating incursion, during which world after world fell before the Chaos onslaught, Imperial colonists were dispatched to resettle Cadian, and these colonists became the ancestors of the modern Cadian population. Interestingly, this new population developed the same violet eyes that had marked the original chaos-worshipping inhabitants. The proximity of the Eye of Terror exerted a subtle, mutagenic influence on human biology that expressed itself consistently across generations. Regardless of the genetic stock, from which the colonists were drawn. The Imperium monitored this mutation carefully, as any deviation from the baseline human genome raised concerns about potential chaos corruption. Oh, but the violet eyes proved to be entirely benign. They became the trademark of the Cadian people, a visible badge of identity that was recognized and respected throughout the Imperium. The early defenses of the newly resettled Cadia proved woefully inadequate when tested by the Second Black Crusade in the 32nd Millennium. The cities had been constructed in the traditional high Terran style, with broad or ordered avenues that were aesthetically pleasing but offered little in the way of defensive advantage. The Second Black Crusade exposed these weaknesses with brutal efficiency, and the Imperium responded with sweeping changes. Massive fortifications were constructed across the entire planet. The Cassar cities were redesigned from the ground up, their broad avenues replaced with the interlocking defensive corridors and geometric killing fields that would characterize Cadian urban planning for the next 8,000 years. Orbital defense platforms were constructed. Macro-cannon batteries capable of engaging targets in space were installed, and the population itself was reorganized along military lines, beginning the transformation of Cadia from an ordinary imperial colony into the fortress world that would become legendary. These early centuries established the pattern that would define Cadian life for millennia. Every generation faced the prospect of another Black Crusade, another assault from the Eye of Terror, another wave of demons and traitors and corrupted warriors seeking to break through the gate and pour into the wider Imperium. And every generation responded by making themselves harder, tougher, more disciplined, more prepared. The military traditions that would eventually produce the Cadian shock troops did not emerge fully formed. They were refined over centuries of conflict, each war teaching new lessons, each defeat prompting new innovations, each victory confirming what worked and what did not. The Cadians were not born as the galaxy's finest soldiers. They were forged into that role by the relentless pressure of living on the very edge of damnation. And it was this process of forging, this multi-generational transformation of an entire civilization into a military instrument of supreme quality, that produced perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Cadian military machine, the way it trained its soldiers. Because on Cadia, military training did not begin when you enlisted. It did not begin when you reported to a recruitment center or boarded a transport bound for some distant training facility. On Cadia, military training began at birth, and it never stopped. The Cadian approach to military education was total and all-encompassing, in a way that would seem extreme even by the standards of the most militarized societies in human history. By the age of 5 standard years, most Cadian children could disassemble and reassemble a lasgun, the standard-issue laser weapon that served as the backbone of the Imperial Guard's arsenal. Think about that for a moment. By the time most children on other worlds were learning to read their first words or count to 10, Cadian children were handling military-grade weapons with practiced ease. They could identify the major components of a lasgun by touch alone. They could clear a jammed power cell. They could perform basic maintenance and field repairs. This was not considered unusual or noteworthy on Cadia. It was simply what childhood looked like. From this early foundation, Cadian children progressed through an increasingly rigorous program of military education that ran parallel to their academic schooling. Physical fitness was emphasized from the earliest possible age, with children participating in structured exercise programs designed to build the strength, stamina, and endurance that would be required of them as adult soldiers. Marksmanship training began almost as soon as a child was physically capable of holding a weapon steady, and it continued throughout their entire lives. The Cadians were renowned across the Imperium as exceptional shots, and this reputation was not accidental. It was the product of thousands of hours of practice, beginning in childhood and continuing long after graduation from formal training. But weapons handling and physical fitness were only part of the equation. The Cadian training philosophy placed enormous emphasis on discipline, and not merely the rote obedience of following orders without question, though that was certainly a component. Cadian discipline was something deeper and more complex, a cultivated mental toughness that allowed soldiers to function effectively under conditions of extreme stress, terror, and physical hardship. Remember, these were soldiers who would be expected to face demons, creatures of living nightmare that could drive an unprepared mind to madness simply by existing in their presence. The corrupting influence of chaos was not merely a physical threat, but a psychological and spiritual one, an assault on the very foundations of a person's sanity and identity. Cadian training was designed to produce soldiers who could withstand that assault and continue fighting effectively despite it. This emphasis on mental fortitude was woven into every aspect of Cadian military education. Training exercises were deliberately designed to expose recruits to conditions of extreme stress and disorientation. Night operations, sleep deprivation, simulated warp phenomena, sudden changes in mission parameters, exposure to disturbing imagery and sounds, all of these were standard elements of the Cadian training regimen. The goal was not to brutalize the recruits, though the process was undeniably harsh by any civilized standard. The goal was to inoculate them against the psychological weapons that the forces of chaos would deploy against them on the battlefield. A Cadian soldier who had been exposed to simulated horrors during training was better prepared to face real horrors in combat. They might still feel fear. They were human beings after all, but they had been trained to function through the fear, to channel it into action rather than allowing it to paralyze them. That perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Cadian training system was its emphasis on teamwork and small unit cohesion. Every challenge, every exercise, every evaluation undertaken during basic training was performed in groups of squad size or larger. Success was possible only when the team operated effectively together. Individual brilliance was acknowledged and rewarded, but it was never prioritized over collective effectiveness. The Cadians understood, through bitter experience, that the forces of chaos excelled at isolating and overwhelming individual soldiers. A lone warrior, no matter how skilled or brave, was vulnerable to the psychological weapons of the enemy. But a squad of soldiers who trusted each other implicitly, who had trained together and fought together and suffered together, who knew each other's strengths and weaknesses and could compensate for them instinctively, that kind of unit was a much harder target. Yes, the bonds of brotherhood that formed during Cadian training were not sentimental flourishes. They were a survival mechanism of the highest order. The result of all this training was a soldier of extraordinary quality. A typical Cadian shock trooper who completed the full training pipeline was a physically fit, mentally tough, tactically competent warrior who could handle a wide variety of weapons, operate effectively in virtually any environment, maintain discipline under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and work seamlessly as part of a team. They could fight in urban environments, in open fields, in dense forests, in frozen wastelands, in the airless void of space. They could conduct offensive operations and defensive operations with equal skill. They could transition from one type of warfare to another with a flexibility that confounded enemies who expected them to be specialists in only one area. But this tactical adaptability was one of the hallmarks of the Cadian military tradition, and it was the product of a training system that valued versatility as highly as any other quality. The Cadian training system also produced an unusually high proportion of veterans compared to the regiments raised from other worlds. Because every Cadian began their military education so young and continued it throughout their lives, even the most junior soldier in a Cadian regiment possessed a level of experience and competence that would have marked them as a veteran in many other military forces. Sergeants in the Cadian shock troops were often soldiers of extraordinary experience and ability, non-commissioned officers who served as the backbone of their units, and who were regarded by many military experts as the real secret behind the Cadians' legendary effectiveness. And a good sergeant could hold a squad together through anything, and the Cadian system produced good sergeants with remarkable consistency. But before we move on to the Caskin and the Black Crusades, I want to take a moment to talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of the Cadian shock troops: the sheer emotional weight of what it meant to grow up on Cadia. We have discussed the training, the discipline, the military culture. As we have talked about the equipment and the organization and the tactical doctrines, but I think it is important to pause and consider the human dimension of life on a fortress world that existed on the edge of an abyss. Imagine, if you can, what it would be like to grow up knowing that the thing responsible for every nightmare you have ever had, every demon story you have ever been told, every tale of damnation and corruption and the annihilation of souls, which was visible in the sky above your head every single night. The Eye of Terror was not an abstract threat to the people of Cadia. It was not a theoretical danger discussed by politicians and generals in distant conference rooms. It was there, right there, a swirling, churning maelstrom of impossible colors and impossible shapes that dominated the heavens, a constant, visible reminder that the forces of eternal darkness were right outside the door, pressing against the walls, whispering promises of corruption to anyone weak enough or foolish enough to listen. Cadian children grew up under that sky. They played their games and ate their meals and went to their castellums and practiced their marksmanship and lived their lives under a sky that was, in the most literal possible sense, a window into damnation. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Imagine teaching a 5-year-old to disassemble a lasgun while outside the window. The sky burns with the eldritch light of a tear in reality. Imagine the prayers said at bedtime, not the gentle, comforting prayers of a peaceful world, but the fierce, defensive prayers of a people who understood that the darkness was not metaphorical, but real and hungry and relentless. This constant exposure to the proximity of chaos had a profound effect on the Cadian psyche. It produced a people who were simultaneously deeply faithful and deeply pragmatic. And faith in the Emperor was not optional on Cadia. It was a survival mechanism. When the forces of chaos attacked, and they attacked regularly, it was faith that provided the psychological armor against the mind-bending horror of facing demonic entities. A Cadian soldier who lost their faith was a Cadian soldier who was vulnerable to the whispers of the ruinous powers, and on a world where chaos cult activity was a constant threat, vulnerability was something the Cadians could not afford. But the Cadians were also relentlessly practical. They did not sit in their casas and pray for deliverance. They maintained their weapons. They reinforced their fortifications. They trained their bodies and their minds. They understood that faith without preparation was just wishful thinking, and that preparation without faith was hollow and brittle. The combination of fierce devotion and practical competence that characterized the Cadian approach to life produced soldiers who were both spiritually resilient and tactically effective, a combination that made them uniquely suited to fight the forces of chaos. The social structure of Cadian society reflected this fusion of military necessity and cultural tradition. Social class on Cadia was determined almost entirely by military rank, which created a meritocratic hierarchy in which advancement was theoretically open to anyone with sufficient ability and determination. In practice, the upper echelons of the Cadian officer corps tended to be dominated by established military families whose children had the advantage of connections, resources, and generations of accumulated military knowledge. But the system was not entirely closed. A soldier of exceptional talent could rise far beyond their station, as Ursaka Creed himself demonstrated. The Cadian military establishment valued competence above all else, because competence was what kept them alive. Within the casas, life had a rhythm that was dictated by the military schedule, but was not entirely devoid of the ordinary pleasures and sorrows of human existence. Cadians formed families, though the nature of those families was shaped by the constant demands of military service. Children were raised communally as much as individually, as with the castellums and the youth armies playing a role in socialization that would have been filled by schools and community organizations on a civilian world. Friendships formed in the training grounds often lasted a lifetime, and the bonds between squad mates were among the strongest human connections on the planet. There was even criminal activity on Cadia, because no human society, no matter how disciplined, is entirely free of those who operate outside the law. It has tens of thousands of criminal gangs operated throughout the densely populated casas, and ganga tattoos were common among the troopers raised from these populations. The existence of these gangs was tolerated to a degree by the military authorities, partly because the gangs served as an informal training ground for the kind of street-level combat skills that were valuable in urban warfare, and partly because the energy and aggression channeled into gang activity might otherwise have been directed toward more dangerous forms of rebellion. The Cadian Internal Guard kept the gangs in check, preventing them from becoming genuine threats to order, but they were a recognized part of the social fabric. Religion on Cadia was centered, as it was throughout most of the Imperium, on the worship of the God-Emperor of mankind. But Cadian devotion had its own distinctive character, as shaped by the unique pressures of life on the frontier of the Eye of Terror. Cadian prayers tended to be shorter and more direct than those practiced on worlds where the threat of chaos was more distant. Cadian religious ceremonies were conducted with military efficiency, and the chaplains who served the Cadian regiments were expected to be capable of inspiring faith under fire, literally and figuratively. The phrase "the Emperor protects" was not merely a platitude on Cadia, as it was a statement of strategic reality. The Emperor's protection, channeled through the Astronomicon and the psychic defenses of the Imperium, was a tangible force that helped keep the Eye of Terror at bay. On Cadia, faith was weaponized, and it was wielded with the same precision and discipline that characterized every other aspect of the Cadian military tradition. I also want to spend some time on the armored and mechanized forces that Cadia produced, because the Cadian military machine was not exclusively an infantry affair. The fortress world produced dedicated armored regiments, artillery formations, reconnaissance units, and mechanized infantry that combined the hitting power of heavy weapons with the mobility of armored transports. These specialized formations were no less skilled than the infantry regiments that garnered most of the glory, and they played a crucial role in Cadia's 10,000-year defense. The Cadian armored regiments were particularly noteworthy. The Leman Russ battle tank, that lumbering, magnificent beast of a war machine, was the centerpiece of their fighting doctrine. Cadian tank crews were trained to the same exacting standards as the infantry, spending years learning to operate and maintain their vehicles before being trusted with command of one in combat. The relationship between a Cadian tank crew and their vehicle was intensely personal. Crews named their tanks, decorated them with kill markings and devotional inscriptions, and maintained them with a care that bordered on the religious. The Mechanicus tech priests who serviced the vehicles sometimes grumbled that the Cadians treated their machines as if they were living things, but the tank crews knew something that the tech priests sometimes forgot. A well-maintained, well-loved machine performed better in combat. It was not superstition. Yes, it was a lifetime of experience that taught them that the machine spirit, as the Mechanicus called it, responded to care and attention in ways that could not be quantified by mechanical diagnostics. The Cadian 122nd Armored Regiment was one of the most famous of these formations. It distinguished itself in numerous campaigns across the galaxy, including leading a counterattack against a massive greenskin offensive on the world of Excovar. Our armored Cadian units were known for their aggressive employment of massed tank formations, using the weight and firepower of their Leman Russ squadrons to punch through enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs with a ruthlessness that left their opponents reeling. Cadian artillery was equally formidable. The Basilisk self-propelled gun, mounted on a Chimera chassis, was the workhorse of the Cadian artillery arm, but the Cadians also employed heavier platforms when the situation demanded it. A Cadian artillery doctrine emphasized rapid deployment, accurate fire, and the ability to displace quickly after firing to avoid counter-battery action. These principles had been developed through thousands of years of fighting an enemy that could deploy warp-spawned creatures capable of targeting artillery positions with supernatural accuracy, and they produced gun crews that were among the most skilled and efficient in the Imperium. And the Chimera armored transport was the vehicle that tied all of these elements together. This versatile fighting vehicle served as the mount for Cadian mechanized infantry, allowing squads to move quickly across the battlefield under the protection of armor, while delivering suppressive fire from the vehicle's own weapons. The mechanized infantry doctrine pioneered by the Cadians was widely admired and copied throughout the Imperium, in offering a middle ground between the vulnerability of dismounted infantry and the limited tactical flexibility of pure armored formations. Now let us also consider the broader organizational structure of the Cadian military contribution to the Imperium. The sheer number of regiments that Cadia produced over its history is staggering. The system of numbering Cadian regiments ran into the thousands, with new regiments being raised continuously to replace those lost in combat or deployed to distant war zones. The low number of the famous 8th Cadian suggests it was founded thousands of years ago, perhaps in the very earliest days of the Imperium's presence on Cadia.
Honestly, this is one of the things I love most about the Cadians as a faction. Out of everything in 40k, all the superhuman demigods and ancient alien empires and literal gods of chaos, it is these regular people with flashlights strapped to a battery pack that hit the hardest for me. There's something genuinely moving about a civilization that looked at the literal mouth of hell and said, yeah, we'll raise our kids here, and they'll be tough enough to handle it. No genetic enhancements, no power armor, no divine miracles, just training, grit, and a stubborn refusal to quit. And I think that is why the community latched onto Cadia stands the way it did. It's not really about the planet, it is about what the Cadians represent, which is the idea that ordinary people, when pushed far enough, can be extraordinary. And in a setting where everything is cranked up to 11 and gods walk the battlefield, that is honestly the most compelling story Games Workshop has ever told. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Despite being destroyed numerous times over its long history, the 8th had always been refounded, continuing an almost unbroken record of service that stretched back millennia, before the 13th Black Crusade. The 8th Cadian numbered around 8,000 soldiers, organized into approximately 24 companies. It fielded a dedicated tank group and artillery assets, and it was equipped with ornithopters for aerial reconnaissance and mobility. The regiment's home base was Casa Rorzan, one of the fortress cities of Cadia, though the companies of the 8th were in such high demand that the regiment rarely served together as a cohesive whole. Some individual companies were frequently detached to support other Cadian divisions, serve as training cadres for newly founded regiments, or be seconded to inquisitors as acolytes for specialized missions. The organizational structure of a typical Cadian regiment reflected the practical, function-over-form philosophy that characterized the Cadian military tradition. A colonel commanded the regiment, supported by a command platoon and whatever departamento munitorum officials, including commissars, while it had been assigned to the unit. The regiment included not only its combat formations, but also the logistical, medical, and signals companies that were essential for sustained operations in the field. When additional capabilities were needed, support formations could be attached, including artillery brigades, stormtrooper platoons, sentinel walker companies, and reconnaissance elements. The Cadian military system was modular and adaptable. It designed to be reconfigured for whatever mission was at hand. This organizational flexibility was another factor that contributed to the Cadians' legendary effectiveness. Where many Imperial Guard regiments operated according to rigid doctrinal templates that could not easily accommodate changes in mission requirements, the Cadian system was designed from the ground up to be adaptable. A Cadian regiment could transition from offensive operations to defensive operations, from urban warfare to open field maneuver, from anti-infantry to anti-armor roles, with a fluidity that reflected the versatile training its soldiers had received. The Cadians did not need specialized equipment or specialized training to handle new challenges. They were trained to fight anywhere, against anything, and their organizational structure supported this philosophy. The Ward of Cadia was a decoration awarded to Cadian officers who distinguished themselves during the defense of their homeworld. During the 13th Black Crusade, this honor was bestowed upon 912 Cadian officers in just 3 weeks, a testament to the extraordinary feats of courage and leadership displayed during the final defense. 19 Casercan companies were commended for conspicuous gallantry, and the Order of Olanius Pius, one of the highest honors in the Cadian military tradition, was awarded for the first time in 7 centuries to soldiers of the Cadian Youth Army. Even the unblooded White Shields fought with a courage that earned the recognition of the highest authorities. On Cadia, even the children were heroes. Now, I mentioned earlier that Cadian military training began at birth and never stopped. and I want to elaborate on one particular stage of that process. Yes, because it was central to the Cadian military experience, and it produced some of the most remarkable soldiers in the entire Imperium. I am talking about the White Shields. The term White Shield referred to the Cadian Youth Army, the organization that served as the bridge between childhood military education and full adult service in the Imperial Guard. When Cadian teenagers reached the age of 14 standard years, they were formally inducted into the White Shields, and from that point forward, they were soldiers in every meaningful sense of the word. They wore uniforms, they carried weapons, they trained alongside experienced veterans, and crucially, they fought. The name White Shield came from the distinctive white stripe painted on the helmets of these young soldiers, a marking that identified them as unblooded cadets who had not yet proven themselves in actual combat. In many armies, this kind of marking would have been a source of shame, as a visible reminder that the wearer was not yet a real soldier. Among the Cadians, it carried a different significance. The White Shield was a mark of potential, a visible promise that this young person was being prepared for a destiny of service and sacrifice. Veteran Cadians did not look down on the White Shields. They watched them with the careful, evaluating gaze of craftsmen examining the raw material from which the next generation of masterworks would be shaped. Training within the White Shields was conducted at military academies called castellums, where cadets underwent an intensified version of the military education they had been receiving since childhood. Physical training became more demanding. Tactical instruction became more complex. Weapons training expanded to include heavy weapons, squad support weapons, and the basic operation of military vehicles. But the most significant aspect of White Shield training was the mock battles. When not engaged in formal instruction, the White Shield units fought simulated battles against each other in the Cadian wilderness, a harsh and demanding environment that provided the perfect training ground for soldiers who would one day face the horrors of the Eye of Terror. These were not casual exercises. They were intensely competitive engagements that replicated the conditions of actual combat as closely as possible, using training weapons that delivered painful, though non-lethal, consequences for mistakes. Cadian mock battles were notorious for their intensity, with cadets regularly sustaining injuries that would have been considered unacceptable in the training programs of less martial worlds. But the Cadians understood that pain was the best teacher, and that a soldier who had never experienced the shock and confusion of close combat was a soldier who was not prepared for the real thing. It was during this phase of training that the Cadian military system identified its most promising young soldiers and began channeling them towards specialized roles. The very best, the cadets who demonstrated not just physical ability and combat skill, but exceptional mental toughness, tactical awareness, and leadership potential, were marked for advanced training that would eventually lead them to the ranks of the Kasarkin, the elite of the Cadian military. But we will return to the Kasarkin shortly. For now, let us focus on the majority of White Shields, those who followed the standard path from cadet to full-fledged Cadian shock trooper. Upon reaching maturity, White Shields faced a decision that was not really a decision at all. They could continue their military service by joining the Interior Guard, which was the Cadian Planetary Defense Force, pledging their lives to the direct defense of their homeworld. Or they could join one of the numbered Cadian regiments, destined for service in the Astra Militarum, the vast military machine of the Imperium that fought wars across the breadth of the galaxy. In theory, there was also the option of leaving military service entirely to fill some essential non-combat role in Cadian society, working in the manufactorums or the agricultural sector, or the vast logistics networks that kept everything running. But even these civilians were expected to maintain their military skills and stand ready to fight if called upon. The Interior Guard deserves special mention because it was one of the most unusual features of the Cadian military system and one of the keys to the planet's legendary defensive capability. 1 out of every 10 Cadian soldiers, regardless of their individual abilities or achievements, was inducted into the Interior Guard rather than being assigned to an off-world regiment. This seemingly random selection process had a profound consequence. Many of the very best soldiers produced by the Cadian training system spent their entire careers on Cadia, never serving in the wider Imperium, but instead dedicating their lives to the defense of their homeworld. As a result, Cadia's planetary defense forces were of a quality that rivaled or exceeded many frontline Imperial Guard formations. Where most worlds relied on second-rate militia units for their planetary defense, yet Cadia's Interior Guard was a professional military force of the highest caliber, staffed by soldiers who could have served with distinction in any regiment in the galaxy. This made Cadia an extraordinarily hard target. Any enemy seeking to invade the planet had to contend not only with its formidable fixed defenses, its orbital platforms and macro-cannon batteries and void shield generators, but also with a defending force composed of hundreds of regiment-strength units of soldiers who were every bit as skilled and disciplined as the famous Cadian shock troops who served across the stars. The Interior Guard also served as the primary defense against the internal threat of Chaos Cult activity, which was a constant concern on a world situated so close to the Eye of Terror. The seepage of Chaos influence was persistent and insidious, and without constant vigilance, as it could worm its way into the hearts of even the most loyal citizens. The Interior Guard maintained an unceasing watch for signs of corruption, working alongside agents of the Inquisition to identify and neutralize Chaos cults before they could take root. For those Cadians who were selected for off-world service, the journey from White Shield to Cadian Shock Trooper was a transformation that stripped away the last remnants of civilian identity and forged the young soldier into a weapon of the Emperor. The regiments they joined were organized along standardized lines, with a colonel at the top commanding a force that typically numbered several thousand soldiers divided into companies and platoons. Each company consisted of a command squad and 3 platoons, and then each platoon contained a command element and 3 squads of 10 soldiers, one of whom was a sergeant. This basic structure could be supplemented with additional units as needed, including armored elements, artillery batteries, reconnaissance squads, and specialist formations. The standard equipment of a Cadian shock trooper reflected the practical, no-nonsense character of the Cadian military tradition. The primary weapon was the M36 Cantrail pattern lasgun, as a reliable and effective laser weapon that delivered a beam of focused light capable of penetrating most personal armor at combat ranges. The lasgun was not the most powerful weapon in the Imperial arsenal, not by a considerable margin, but it was cheap to produce, easy to maintain, remarkably reliable even under adverse conditions, and its power cells could be recharged using almost any energy source, including direct sunlight. For a military that needed to equip billions of soldiers across thousands of worlds, these qualities made the lasgun an ideal choice, and the Cadians wielded it with a precision that extracted every ounce of effectiveness from its capabilities. In addition to their lasguns, Cadian shock troopers carried frag grenades for dealing with entrenched enemies and crack grenades for use against armored targets. Sergeants typically carried a las pistol and a chainsword, a weapon that was exactly what it sounded like. A sword with a motorized chain of diamond-hard teeth running along its edge that could chew through armor and flesh with equal ease. Squads could also be equipped with heavier weapons, including grenade launchers, flamers for clearing buildings and bunkers, plasma guns that fired superheated matter, and melter guns that could reduce armored vehicles to molten slag. The Cadians wore standard-issue flak armor, and a practical form of body protection that provided reasonable defense against shrapnel, small arms fire, and glancing hits from heavier weapons without sacrificing too much mobility. It was not power armor, the sealed and servo-assisted suits worn by Space Marines that could shrug off hits that would destroy a tank. Flak armor would not save you from a direct hit by a bolter round or a burst from a heavy weapons platform. But it could mean the difference between life and death against the kinds of threats that rank-and-file soldiers most commonly encountered, and the Cadians wore it with the casual familiarity of soldiers who had spent their entire lives in military gear. One of the most important pieces of equipment in any Cadian squad was the Voxcaster, a portable communications device that allowed the squad to stay in contact with higher command elements. Yet communication was essential on the battlefields of the 41st Millennium, where the fog of war could be literal as well as figurative, and where the forces of chaos could disrupt conventional communications through warp interference. A squad with a functioning voxcaster could receive updated orders, call for fire support, coordinate with adjacent units, and report intelligence about enemy movements. A squad without one was fighting blind, was dependent entirely on the judgment and initiative of its own members. The Cadians were resourceful enough to operate effectively, even without communications, their training emphasizing adaptability and initiative alongside discipline and obedience. But the voxcaster remained a critical asset. Beyond the infantry squads that formed the core of every Cadian regiment, the military forces raised on Cadia also included dedicated mechanized, armored artillery and reconnaissance formations. Cadian armored regiments operated the legendary Leman Russ battle tank, the workhorse of the Imperial Guard's armored forces, a massively built war machine that traded speed and agility for sheer staying power and devastating firepower. The Leman Russ was slow by the standards of modern armored vehicles, but it was built like a fortress on treads, its thick armor capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy lighter vehicles, and its main gun capable of engaging targets at ranges that made infantry weapons irrelevant. In the hands of skilled Cadian crews who had trained on these vehicles since their youth, the Leman Russ was a fearsome weapon. Cadian artillery formations operated a variety of long-range weapons platforms, including the Basilisk self-propelled gun, which could drop high-explosive shells on enemy positions from distances measured in kilometers. Artillery was a cornerstone of Cadian tactical doctrine. The Cadians understood that in a defensive war against the forces of chaos, the ability to break up enemy formations before they reached the defensive perimeter was worth more than any amount of close combat skill. Concentrated artillery fire could shatter an advancing horde, disrupt the formation of demon summoning rituals, and destroy the command elements that coordinated enemy assaults. Cadian artillery crews were known for their accuracy and their ability to deliver fire on target with remarkable speed, a product of the same intensive training that made their infantry so effective. But of all the specialized formations within the Cadian military machine, none commanded greater respect or admiration than the Kasrkin. And this is where our story takes us into the realm of the truly exceptional, because the Kasrkin were not merely good soldiers. They were the elite of an army of elites, the best of the best of the best, and their reputation extended far beyond the borders of the Cadian system to encompass the entire Imperium of man. The word Kasrkin came from the Kasr fortress cities of Cadia, and it denoted a class of warrior that occupied a unique position in the Cadian military hierarchy. The Kasrkin were, in the formal classification of the Departamento Munitorum, as the sprawling bureaucracy that administered the Imperium's military forces, categorized as grenadiers, a type of elite special forces formation analogous to the Tempestus Scions, who served other branches of the imperial military. But the Kasrkin were not Tempestus Scions. They were something different, something that could only have been produced by the unique culture and military tradition of Cadia. The path to becoming a Kasrkin began early, during the White Shield phase of a soldier's career. The most promising cadets, those who demonstrated exceptional physical ability, mental toughness, tactical intelligence, and leadership potential, were identified by their instructors and marked for special attention. But being marked was only the beginning. The selected candidates were enrolled in specialized academies where they received additional training on top of the already demanding White Shield curriculum. This additional training was, by all accounts, extraordinarily punishing, whilst it was designed to push the candidates to the absolute limits of human endurance and beyond, to break them down and rebuild them as something harder, faster, and more dangerous than anything the standard training pipeline could produce. But here is the thing that made the Kasrkin selection process so remarkable. Being marked for Kasrkin training did not exempt a candidate from the standard requirements of the Cadian military system. But the potential Kasrkin recruits still had to serve as regular Cadian shock troopers first. They still had to prove themselves in the line units. They still had to earn the respect of their fellow soldiers through actual combat performance. They still had to become hardened veterans before they were guided to the Kasrkin academies for their final phase of advanced training. The Kasrkin selection process was not a shortcut to elite status. It was a longer, harder, and more demanding road that produced soldiers of staggering capability. The training that Kasrkin candidates underwent at the specialized academies was considered by military experts throughout the Imperium to be more demanding than even the training provided to the Tempestus Scions at the Schola Progenium, the Imperium's elite military training institutions. This was a significant claim because the Schola Progenium's training programs were legendary for their intensity. The Scions produced by those institutions were formidable warriors by any standard. But the Kasrkin training went further, pushing its candidates harder and demanding more of them in every measurable dimension. The comparison was often made that Kasrkin training was the mortal equivalent of the Death Watch, the elite alien hunting formation composed of hand-picked space marines from across the Imperium's chapters, coming from mere humans. That was an almost incomprehensible level of military excellence. What set the Kasrkin apart from the Tempestus Scions, beyond the sheer intensity of their training, was their origin and their motivation. Tempestus Scions were orphans raised from childhood in the Schola Progenium, isolated from normal society and indoctrinated to serve the Imperium as a whole. They were superb soldiers, but they lacked any connection to a specific world or culture. They fought for the Imperium in the abstract. As the Kasrkin, by contrast, were products of Cadian society. They had grown up on Cadia. They had played in the shadow of the pylons and watched the Eye of Terror swirl in the sky above their heads. They had friends and families, and a community that they were personally invested in defending. Their loyalty was not to an abstract concept of imperial service, but to a specific place and a specific people. And this gave them an emotional intensity that complemented their technical skill in a way that few other military forces could match. Kasrkin soldiers were equipped with superior war gear that reflected their elite status. Where standard shock troopers wore flak armor, Kasrkin wore carapace armor, a heavier and more protective form of body protection that offered significantly greater resistance to enemy fire. Where standard shock troopers carried M36 laser guns, Kasrkin were armed with hotshot laser guns, also known as hell guns, which drew power from backpack-mounted generators to produce a more powerful beam capable of penetrating armor that would turn aside a standard laser gun shot. The hotshot laser gun sacrificed the standard laser gun's high rate of fire and unlimited power cell recharging capability in exchange for raw penetrating power, as a trade-off that reflected the Kasrkin's role as shock troops, who were expected to engage the enemy's most heavily armored and dangerous elements. Kasrkin were instantly recognizable, even when not equipped with their full panoply of war. Aside from their heavily muscled physiques, honed by years of the most demanding physical training available, they all bore the brand of the Caducade's sea eagle on their necks. This tattoo marked them as members of the Cadian elite, and it was worn with a fierce pride that spoke to the honor associated with the Kasrkin title. Among the standard Cadian shock troopers, the Kasrkin were held in deep respect. Where the elite formations of some other armies were resented by the rank and file for their special status and perceived arrogance, the Kasrkin were regarded by their fellow Cadians as the embodiment of everything the Cadian military tradition aspired to. They were the proof that the system worked, and that the grueling years of training and sacrifice could produce warriors of truly exceptional quality. In combat, the Kasrkin were typically deployed in the most dangerous and demanding roles available. They led the advance against fortified positions. They were dropped behind enemy lines to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage missions. They served as the spearhead of assaults against the most heavily defended objectives. They formed the rearguard during desperate retreats, or while holding the line while less capable units withdrew to safety. They were the soldiers who were sent in when the situation was most dire, when the standard forces had been pushed to their limits and something more was needed, and they consistently delivered. The record of Kasrkin engagements across the history of the Imperium is a catalogue of extraordinary martial achievement, a testament to what mere humans could accomplish through training, discipline, and sheer force of will. After the fall of Cadia, the Kasrkin tradition did not die. New Kasrkin continued to be recruited from the surviving Cadian shock trooper regiments scattered across the galaxy. The standards were maintained. The training, adapted to the realities of a people who no longer had a homeworld, but who carried the spirit of Cadia in their blood and their bones, continued to produce warriors of exceptional quality. The caducade sea eagle continued to be branded on the necks of those who earned it. And wherever Kasrkin fought, they fought with the additional fury of soldiers who had a homeworld to avenge. Now, to truly understand the Cadian shock troops and the world that produced them, we need to talk about what they were fighting against. Because the Cadians were not merely soldiers who happened to live near a dangerous place. They were the gatekeepers of the Imperium, the men and women who stood between humanity and the concentrated fury of chaos itself. And the threats they faced over their 10,000-year history were of a magnitude that is difficult to comprehend. The story of the Cadian shock troops is inseparable from the story of the Black Crusades, those titanic clashes between the forces of order and chaos that shaped the fate of the galaxy across millennia. Let us begin with the First Black Crusade, because that is where the long war between Cadia and the forces of the War Master truly began. Approximately 500 standard years after the end of the Horus Heresy, the catastrophic civil war that had nearly destroyed the Imperium from within, a figure emerged from the Eye of Terror at the head of an army that the wider Imperium had believed was gone forever. His name was Ezekiel Abaddon, once the first captain of the Lunar Wolves Legion, later the Sons of Horus, and now the self-proclaimed War Master of the newly founded Black Legion. But the wider Imperium had assumed that the traitor legions who had fled into the Eye of Terror after the heresy's defeat would destroy each other in their internecine wars or simply fade into irrelevance. They were wrong. Abaddon had spent the intervening centuries within the Eye, rebuilding his forces, forging the disparate remnants of the traitor legions into a new and terrifying instrument of war, and making dark pacts with the chaos gods that granted him power beyond anything a mortal should possess. When he finally emerged from the Eye at the head of his Black Legion, the Imperium was caught completely off guard. Worlds fell by the dozen. Millions died in the first week alone. The forces of chaos swept through the sectors surrounding the Eye of Terror with a ferocity that had not been seen since the darkest days of the heresy. But one world held, Cadia, the fortress world, the newly fortified and grimly determined, stood firm against the tide of damnation. On the world of Earthward, Cadian forces aided by the Imperial Fists, 4th and 5th Companies, fought a desperate defensive action against Chaos forces led by the first war engines known as Defilers. After 4 days of brutal combat, the Chaos forces were repulsed. It was Cadia's first test as the Guardian of the Gate, and it passed. The First Black Crusade eventually spent itself, driven back by the combined efforts of the Imperial military. But it left a profound mark on the Imperium's strategic thinking. The threat from the Eye of Terror was real, it was existential, and it would come again. The fortification of Cadia accelerated dramatically in the aftermath of the First Black Crusade. A vast naval port was established at Bellis Corona. A fortress was constructed on Nemesis Tessera, and the Cadian military machine, already formidable, was expanded and refined to meet the challenges that everyone knew lay ahead. Over the course of the next 10,000 years, the forces of Chaos launched 12 more Black Crusades against the Imperium, each led by Abaddon or another powerful Chaos champion. Each was a test of Cadia's defenses. Each brought destruction and death on a scale that would have overwhelmed any less prepared world. And each, with the notable and tragic exception of the final one, was ultimately defeated. The Second Black Crusade struck directly at Cadia itself, testing the newly constructed fortifications. The Third Black Crusade was a cunning diversion, with Abaddon unleashing the demon prince Talamin against the Cadian Gate, while he pursued a secret objective elsewhere, the desecration of Saint Gerstall's tomb. The demon prince, slew millions before the Space Wolves finally drove him back. But Abaddon achieved his true goal. This pattern repeated across the centuries. Some Black Crusades were direct assaults on Cadia and the surrounding systems. Others were more subtle operations, with Abaddon using the apparent chaos of his attacks to disguise more specific objectives. What the Imperium did not understand, not until it was far too late, was that each of these Black Crusades was part of a larger plan. Abaddon called it the Crimson Path. Throughout the millennia, he had identified ancient monoliths and structures, similar to the pylons on Cadia, and that held back the tides of the warp across various worlds near the Eye of Terror. His Black Crusades were not merely attempts to break through the Cadian Gate. They were systematic campaigns to locate and destroy these warp-dampening structures, weakening the barrier between reality and the immaterium one piece at a time. Each seemingly failed crusade had actually accomplished its true objective, chipping away at the defenses that held the Eye of Terror in check, bringing the forces of chaos one step closer to their ultimate goal, the expansion of the Eye to swallow the galaxy itself. The 12th Black Crusade, known as the Gothic War, was particularly significant. Launched in 139 M41, it targeted the Gothic sector, where several of the mysterious alien constructs known as the Blackstone Fortresses orbited various worlds. These massive structures had been converted by the Imperium into orbital bases for the Imperial Navy. But they were far more than they appeared. They were ancient weapons of unimaginable power, capable of generating beams of focused warp energy that could obliterate entire planets. Abaddon captured at least 2 of these Blackstone fortresses during the Gothic War, adding weapons of world-ending capability to his arsenal. The Imperium managed to prevent the loss of the remaining fortresses with the help of an uneasy alliance with the Aeldari, but the damage was done. Abaddon now possessed the tools he needed for his final assault. Through all of these crusades, the Cadian shock troops fought with a tenacity and skill that earned them a reputation rivaled by no other conventional military force in the Imperium. They bled and died in numbers that would have broken the morale of lesser armies, but they never broke. They adapted to every new threat. They learned from every engagement. They passed their hard-won knowledge to the next generation, and the next, and the next. The culture of eternal vigilance that defined Cadian society was not mere tradition or dogma. It was a living, breathing practice, refined and updated with every campaign, every battle, every skirmish along the frontier of human existence. During the periods between Black Crusades, the Cadian shock troops did not sit idle. Cadian regiments served across the entire breadth of the Imperium, fighting in every conceivable theater of war against every enemy the galaxy could produce. They fought orcs on a dozen worlds. They faced the alien menace of the Tyranids. They battled the enigmatic Aeldari and the coldly mechanical Necrons. They suppressed insurrections and purged heretical cults. They served as garrison troops and expeditionary forces. They trained alongside Space Marine chapters and Sisters of Battle. Everywhere they went, they brought with them the disciplined professionalism that was the hallmark of the Cadian tradition, and everywhere they went, they earned the respect of their allies and the fear of their enemies. It was this breadth of experience that made the Cadians so adaptable. Unlike many Imperial Guard regiments that specialized in one type of warfare, the Cadian shock troops were genuine all-around forces, capable of fighting effectively in any environment against any opponent. A Cadian regiment that had spent the last decade fighting orcs in jungle terrain could be redeployed to an urban war zone against heretic cultists and perform with equal competence. This versatility was a reflection of the Cadian training philosophy, which emphasized flexibility and initiative alongside discipline and obedience, and it made Cadian regiments some of the most sought-after formations in the entire Astra Militarum, as commanders across the Imperium requested Cadian reinforcements for their most difficult campaigns, knowing that the violet-eyed soldiers from the fortress world would deliver results regardless of the situation they were thrown into. The 612 Cadian shock troop regiments that were committed to the defense of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade represented only a fraction of the total number of Cadian regiments in existence at that time. Hundreds more were deployed across the galaxy, fighting on worlds that most of them would never return from. For those regiments, the news of Cadia's destruction would come as a devastating blow, a loss so profound that it threatened to shatter the very foundation of their identity as soldiers. But we are not there yet. Before we reach the fall, we need to talk about the man who led the defense and the legends who fought beside him. We need to talk about the heroes of Cadia. Every army needs leaders, and the Cadian shock troops produce some of the finest military commanders the Imperium of man has ever known. But one name stands above all others in the annals of Cadian history. One figure who embodied everything that it meant to be a soldier of Cadia, and whose story is so intertwined with the fate of his world that the two cannot be separated. His name was Ursaka E. Creed, and he was the last Lord Castellan of Cadia. Creed's origins were anything but auspicious, and he was discovered as a young orphan boy in the burning ruins of Casa Galan by soldiers of the 8th Cadian Regiment in the aftermath of a chaos attack. The details of what had happened to him, what horrors he had witnessed, what had become of his family, were never spoken of. Creed himself refused to discuss the events of that day, even decades later, maintaining a silence on the subject that no one who knew him ever dared to challenge. While what the soldiers who found him saw was a hard-eyed child clutching a service pistol in one hand and a tattered copy of a book called De Gloria Macarius in the other. De Gloria Macarius was a military text, a study of the campaigns of Lord Solar Macarius, one of the greatest military commanders in Imperial history. That a child had chosen to salvage a book on military strategy while fleeing for his life from a chaos attack told the soldiers everything they needed to know about the kind of person they had just found. Creed was taken in by the 8th Cadian Regiment and raised within its ranks. It was during his time as a White Shield that he forged the friendship that would define the rest of his life. A bond with a fellow cadet named Jaron Kell. Kell was everything that Creed was not in terms of temperament. Where Creed was cerebral and calculating, always thinking 3 moves ahead, Kell was straightforward and steady, a rock of reliability and loyalty. Where Creed excelled at the grand strategic picture, seeing patterns and opportunities that others missed, Kell was the consummate sergeant, the man who made sure that orders were not just given, but executed with precision and efficiency. The two complemented each other perfectly, and as they rose through the ranks together, they became one of the most formidable command partnerships in Cadian history. Creed's rise through the officer corps was swift, driven by a natural genius for command that manifested early and only grew more pronounced with experience. He proved himself a masterful strategist, adept at coordinating both defense and attack, capable of commanding anything from a single platoon to an entire army with equal skill. Plus, his tactical acumen was described by those who served under him as bordering on the preternatural. Creed seemed to possess an instinct for the flow of battle that went beyond mere training or experience. He could read the shifting patterns of a conflict the way a master musician reads sheet music, anticipating changes before they occurred and positioning his forces to exploit them with devastating effect. During the Hrud migration of 983 to 985 in the 41st Millennium, Creed fought with Kell at his side, earning distinction in a campaign that tested the limits of Cadian endurance against one of the galaxy's most insidious alien threats. He went on to serve as the commander of the forces that tracked down and killed the Chaos Lord Brule on the world of Trekanondal, a victory that earned him promotion to Lord General. His first action as a Lord General was the defeat of an Aeldari raid from Craftworld Ulthwi on the world of Ornet in 992 M41, and a victory so complete that it cemented his reputation as the most capable living Cadian commander. At this point, the only thing preventing Creed's further advancement was the rigid class structure of the Cadian military hierarchy. Social class on Cadia was determined by military rank, which in turn was heavily influenced by family background. The upper echelons of the Cadian officer corps were dominated by the sons and daughters of established military families, and Creed's humble origins, or rather, his complete lack of origins, since no one knew who his parents had been or what rank they had held, made him an outsider in the circles of power. He was the orphan from Casa Gallen, the boy with no name and no lineage, and for all his brilliance on the battlefield, that counted against him among the Cadian aristocracy. All of that changed with a betrayal so treacherous that it shook the foundations of the Cadian military establishment. As the forces of the Imperium gathered on Cadia to prepare for the looming threat of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, the worst possible thing happened. Treachery. A regiment of the Astra Militarum, called the Volscani Cataphracts, stationed on Cadia as part of the gathering defense force, revealed their true allegiance to the Chaos Gods. The Volscani had been secretly corrupted. Their officers and soldiers turned to the service of the ruinous powers. And at the most critical possible moment, they struck. The betrayal came at the Battle of Tyrok Fields, where the defending forces had mustered for inspection and preparation. Without warning, the Volscani Cataphracts opened fire on their unsuspecting comrades, cutting down hundreds of loyal guardsmen before any coordinated response could be organized. But the Volscani's primary objective was not the rank and file. Their real target was the Cadian High Command, was the traitorous regiment swarmed aboard the Leviathan command vehicle of the Governor Primus of Cadia and slaughtered him, along with most of the senior command staff of the Cadian military, including the overall commander of the defense forces. In a matter of minutes, the entire leadership structure of the Cadian defense had been decapitated. It was in this moment of utter chaos, with the Cadian command structure in ruins and the defending forces reeling from the shock of betrayal, that Ursarkar Creed stepped into the role that fate, or perhaps the Emperor himself, had been preparing him for. As a colonel of the 8th Cadian Regiment, Creed was not the highest-ranking surviving officer, but he was the one who acted. While others were paralyzed by shock, Creed took immediate command. He rallied the shattered remnants of the defending forces, organized them into a coherent fighting formation, and led them in a counterattack against the traitorous Volscani. The 8th Cadian was with Colour Sergeant Jaron Kell unfurling the regimental banner and leading the Imperium Gloriam chant, charged directly into the ranks of the enemy. It was a moment of pure Cadian defiance, a demonstration of the courage and discipline that had been bred into these soldiers over thousands of years. In the chaos of the engagement, Creed was observed by veteran guardsmen to take a knee and place his hand on the ground, an action that some later claimed was a prayer to the Emperor, while others speculated that the tactician in him was literally feeling the vibrations of the earth to gauge the timing of the enemy's advance. Whatever the truth, Creed rose, gave the order to fix bayonets, and led his soldiers into the fight with a ferocity that turned the tide. Through his decisive actions, what might have been a catastrophic defeat for the Imperium was turned into a defining moment for the defenders of Cadia. The Volscani were destroyed. As Creed personally recovered the body of the fallen Governor Primus, wrapping it in the banner of the 8th Cadian and carrying it from the battlefield with a reverence that spoke volumes about his character. In the aftermath of the battle, the question of who would lead the defense of Cadia could not be avoided. In times of extreme emergency, Cadian military tradition allowed for the appointment of a Lord Castellan, then the supreme commander invested with absolute authority over all military forces on the planet for the duration of the crisis. Creed's opponents in the political arena hesitated. His common birth still counted against him in the eyes of the aristocratic officer class. But the rank-and-file soldiers of Cadia knew who had saved them at Tyrok Fields. They knew who had led the counterattack that prevented the total destruction of the command structure. And they knew who had stood in the fire when everyone else was frozen by shock and despair. The name was offered to Creed, and in keeping with the ritual traditions of the Cadian military, he refused it 3 times. But he knew, as did everyone else, that the soldiers of Cadia would accept no other leader. His political opponents, faced with the reality that opposing Creed's appointment would divide the defenders at the worst possible moment, stepped aside. Ursarkar E. Creed was named Lord Castellan of Cadia, supreme commander of all military forces on the planet, and de facto ruler of the fortress world. The rank and file greeted the announcement with jubilation. They had their leader. Now they would fight. At Creed's side, as always, was Color Sergeant Jaron Kell. Kell was more than just Creed's bodyguard, though he was certainly that, carrying his power fist and power sword with a readiness that spoke of a lifetime of close protection work. Kell was Creed's voice on the battlefield, his vox-amplified commands cutting through the din of combat to ensure that the Lord Castellan's orders reached every unit in the line. The two men worked as a single unit, Creed reading the flow of battle and issuing orders with the speed of a mind operating at its absolute peak. And Kell translating those orders into action with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to turn the Lord Castellan's thoughts into military reality. Kell was a deeply devout man, and he wore the Medallion Crimson, an honor awarded only to Imperial guardsmen who had suffered horrific injuries in battle, yet had lost neither their faith in the Emperor nor their will to fight on. The Medallion Crimson was not given lightly, and the fact that Kell wore it was a testament to both his physical toughness and his spiritual resilience. Together, Creed and Kell formed the heart of the Cadian defense, a partnership that embodied the finest qualities of the Cadian military tradition: strategic brilliance and steadfast loyalty, tactical genius and unwavering faith. But Creed was not the only hero who would emerge from the defense of Cadia. The 13th Black Crusade drew warriors from across the Imperium to the defense of the fortress world, and many of them would write their names in legend through their actions during the campaign. Space Marines from dozens of chapters converged on the Cadian system, bringing with them the superhuman combat capability that only genetically engineered warriors could provide. The Sisters of Battle, the militant arm of the Imperial faith, arrived with their white-hot devotion and their miracles of divine intervention. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributed its technological might, its legions of augmented Scutarii warriors, and its massive war machines. Even Xenos allies, the enigmatic Aeldari and the coldly calculating Necrons, would play crucial roles in the drama that was about to unfold. But at the center of it all, and holding the line with nothing but laser guns and bayonets, and the fierce determination of soldiers who had been bred for this moment across 100 generations, were the Cadian shock troops. And the story of their final battle, the defense of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade, is one of the most epic and tragic chapters in the entire history of the Imperium of Man. The 13th Black Crusade began, as many of Abaddon's campaigns had begun, with portents of doom, space hulks, and massive conglomerations of derelict ships fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp, began emerging from the Imperium around the Cadian sector in increasing numbers. Some were intercepted and destroyed by the Imperial Navy or boarded by Space Marine strike teams. Others slipped through the blockade and struck at strategically important worlds and naval bases, crippling the region's defensive infrastructure. The dreaded Chaos vessel Plagueclaw appeared in the outer reaches of the Earthwart system, spreading pestilence wherever it went. The forces of Chaos were softening up the defenses, probing for weaknesses, wearing down the defenders before the main assault even began. Then came the Plague. A deadly virus called the Plague of Unbelief swept through the Cadian sector, carried by contaminated cargo aboard the Space Hulks. Those who contracted it died quickly and horribly, and in some cases, their corpses reanimated as plague zombies, shambling horrors that spread the infection even further. Worlds fell into anarchy. Chaos cults, emboldened by the spreading disorder, rose up on dozens of planets, adding internal rebellion to the external threat. The Cadian sector was being slowly strangled before the main blow ever fell. On Cadia itself, the situation was made even more ominous by the behavior of the ancient pylons. The mysterious structures began to vibrate with an energy that could be detected by sensitive instruments, and microscopic fractures appeared on their surfaces. The pylons were reacting to the growing pressure of the warp, their ancient mechanisms straining to hold back the tide of immaterial energy that was building beyond the Eye of Terror. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus observed these phenomena with alarm, but were unable to explain them. The pylons were fighting, in their own enigmatic way, to maintain the barrier between reality and nightmare, but they were being pushed to their limits. Despite the deteriorating situation in the surrounding sectors, Cadia remained a beacon of stability. The Cadian High Command, before its destruction at Tyrock Fields, had ordered every regiment of the Cadian shock troops to muster on the homeworld. This unprecedented recall brought 612 shock troop regiments, 486 companies of Kaskin, and 36 regional commands of the Cadian Youth Army to the defense of their planet. It was the largest concentration of Cadian military force in history, and it represented the full might of a civilization that had spent 10,000 years preparing for exactly this moment. The main assault came with overwhelming force. Abaddon's Black Fleet emerged from the warp near the Cadian system, a fleet of such staggering size that it dwarfed anything the Imperium had seen since the Horus Heresy. At its heart was the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity, a captured alien superweapon of almost inconceivable destructive potential, now serving as Abaddon's personal command center. The Chaos Fleet was accompanied by the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's old flagship, and the Planet Killer, a massive weapons platform capable of destroying entire worlds. Admiral Quarren, commanding the Imperial Navy forces defending the Cadian system, fought a desperate delaying action against the approaching Chaos Fleet. His ships were outgunned and outnumbered, and despite heroic resistance, the majority of the Imperial fleet in the Cadian system was either crippled or destroyed within 3 days. The outer defenses of the system crumbled. Solar Mariatus, the outermost planet, fell quickly, and the Chaos forces established forward bases from which to launch attacks throughout the system. The prison world of Saint. Josmain's hope was captured by the Violators' warband, who pressed its millions of inmates into service as slaves and cannon fodder. Then came the betrayal at Tyrock Fields that we discussed earlier, the treachery of the Volskani cataphracts that decapitated the Cadian command structure and brought Creed to power. From that point forward, the defense of Cadia became a story of desperate improvisation and superhuman determination. The initial Chaos landings on Cadia were met with ferocious resistance. The Cadian shock troops, fighting from their prepared positions in the Kassar cities and the defensive lines that crisscrossed the planet's surface, made the invaders pay dearly for every meter of ground. The interlocking kill zones and fortified positions that had been designed and improved over 8,000 years proved their worth, as channeling the Chaos advance into prepared killing fields where concentrated fire could be brought to bear with devastating effect. Creed coordinated the defense with the brilliance that had made him famous, shifting reserves to threatened sectors, organizing counterattacks at precisely the right moments, and maintaining the cohesion of his forces despite the constant pressure of an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reserves. Yet the first phase of the battle ended in something approaching a victory for the defenders. The Chaos forces that had made planetfall were contained and, in many areas, driven back. The Cadian shock troops, supported by Space Marines, Sisters of Battle, and other Imperial forces, had held the line. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Cadia might endure once again, as it had endured through 12 previous Black Crusades. But Creed was not fooled. He understood, and with the tactical intuition that was his greatest gift, that what they had defeated was merely the vanguard. The real attack was still coming, and he was right. The second wave of the 13th Black Crusade was of an entirely different magnitude than the first. Abaddon committed his full strength, hurling wave after wave of Chaos Space Marines, demonic hordes, corrupted titans, and millions of cultists and traitors against the Cadian defenses. The battles that followed were among the most brutal and horrific in the history of the Imperium. One by one, the Kassars fell. Kassa after Kassa was overwhelmed, its defenders fighting to the last in the urban labyrinth of streets and corridors that had been designed for exactly this kind of defense. Each fallen Kassa cost the Chaos forces dearly, but there were always more enemies to replace the fallen, and the defenders had no such luxury. Our Creed was forced to make the agonizing decisions that every commander dreads, abandoning positions that could no longer be held, sacrificing rearguard units to buy time for the main body to withdraw, trading space for time in a desperate attempt to maintain a viable defense. The fighting coalesced around Casa Kraf, the last major casa still holding out against the Chaos onslaught. This fortress city became the final bastion of the Imperial defense, the point upon which the fate of Cardia would be decided. Reinforcements trickled in from across the Imperium: space marine companies, knight households, mechanicus forces, each one a welcome addition, but never enough to tip the balance decisively. Among the forces that arrived was the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, whose fleet took up position alongside the Phalanx, the massive mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists chapter that had arrived to support the defense. As it was Call who provided the revelation that would have changed everything. Working with the Necron overlord Trazian the Infinite, who had appeared on Cadian, driven by his own mysterious motivations, Call determined the true nature and purpose of the ancient pylons. He discovered that they could be activated to their full potential, and that at full power, they would not merely hold the Eye of Terror in check, but would actively push it back, at closing the warp rift that had tormented this region of space for millions of years. The solution to the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced was right there, buried in the soil of Cadian, waiting to be awakened. The Imperial forces raced to activate the pylon network, while simultaneously defending against the relentless Chaos assault. It was a race against time, with the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. As Call and Trazian worked to bring the pylons online, the Cadian shock troops and their allies fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that they were defending not just their world, but the entire Imperium. The battles during this phase of the campaign were among the most intense of the entire crusade, with Chaos forces throwing everything they had at the defenders in a frantic effort to prevent the pylons from being activated. And then something extraordinary happened. The pylons began to work. As Call's modifications took effect and the ancient Necron technology came online at full power, the Eye of Terror began to shrink. The warp was being pushed back. Demons that had been manifesting on Cadia's surface began to flicker and fade as the anti-psychic field generated by the pylon network reasserted the dominance of reality over the immaterium. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as though the impossible was happening. After 65 million years, the wound in reality was finally beginning to heal. Abaddon saw what was happening, and he understood the implications immediately. If the pylons completed their activation, everything he had worked toward for 10,000 years would be undone. The Eye of Terror would close. The Crimson Path would be destroyed. His armies, trapped on the wrong side of a sealed warp rift, would be cut off from the dark powers that sustained them. Everything he had sacrificed, every pact he had made, in every world he had burned, would be rendered meaningless. And so the War Master of Chaos made a decision born of rage and desperation. If he could not have Cadian intact, then no one would have it at all. Abaddon abandoned his attempt to conquer the planet through conventional military force. Instead, he directed the massive bulk of the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity, already badly damaged from an earlier attack by the Phalanx, to be sent plunging into the surface of Cadian itself. The impact was catastrophic beyond imagination. A structure the size of a small moon, composed of the densest and most energetic material in the galaxy, struck the surface of Cadian with enough kinetic energy to shatter a continent. The force of the impact destroyed the pylon fields across the planet in an instant, ending Call's attempt to close the Eye of Terror. It tectonically destabilized the world, by fracturing the very foundations of the planet, and setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately tear Cadian apart. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, the anti-psychic field generated by the pylon network collapsed. The Eye of Terror, no longer held in check, began to expand. Demons poured into reality, not the flickering, half-formed manifestations that had been possible while the pylons were active, but the full-fledged, embodied servants of the ruinous powers, hale and whole and terrible beyond description. The defenders of Cadian, already battered and bleeding from months of continuous combat, now faced an enemy that could not be defeated by lace guns and bayonets. Creed made the decision that no Lord Castellan had ever made before. He ordered the evacuation of Cadian, the fortress world that had stood for 10,000 years, that had endured 12 Black Crusades and countless lesser assaults, that had been the shield of the Imperium and the pride of its soldiers, was lost. There was nothing more that could be done. The world was dying, torn apart from within by tectonic forces, unleashed by the Blackstone Fortress impact, and consumed from without by the expanding Eye of Terror. All that remained was to save as many lives as possible. The evacuation was a nightmare of chaos and desperation. Imperial transport ships, many of them already damaged from the fighting, and struggled to lift as many soldiers and civilians as they could while the planet disintegrated beneath them. The Phalanx provided covering fire against the Chaos Fleet, its massive weapons clearing corridors through the enemy formation through which the transports could escape. The Eldari, who had arrived as part of an unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of desperation, opened webway gates through which some of the survivors could escape. But someone had to hold the line, as someone had to keep the demons at bay while the transports lifted off. Someone had to stand in the gap and buy time with their lives so that others might escape. That someone was Ursarkar E. Creed and the 8th Cadian Regiment. The Lord Castellan's own made their final stand on the dying world of Cadia, facing endless hordes of demons with the same discipline and courage that had defined the regiment for thousands of years. They held, because that was what Cadians did. They fought, as because fighting was the only language they had ever known. They died, because dying in defense of their homeworld was the highest honor a soldier of Cadia could achieve. Creed himself accepted his fate with the stoic resolve that had characterized his entire career. He had done everything in his power to save Cadia, and it had not been enough. The forces arrayed against him had been too great, the treachery of fate too cruel. But even in this moment of ultimate defeat, the Lord Castellan did not despair. He had saved millions of lives with his decision to evacuate. He had given the Imperium a fighting chance to continue the war. He had done his duty. As Cadia crumbled around him, Creed was approached by a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. A giant in strange scaled armor, laughing, amused by something that the Lord Castellan could not comprehend. The giant told Creed that his time need not end here. This enigmatic figure was Trazyn the Infinite, the Necron overlord who had aided Call in the attempt to activate the pylons. Trazyn captured Creed within a tesseract labyrinth, a Necron device capable of holding a living being in a state of suspended animation, and added the Lord Castellan to his personal collection of historically significant persons and artifacts on his tomb, World of Solemnace. The exhibit was labelled with the Necron's characteristic dry humour, and as the last stand of Ursarkar Creed. Whether this constituted a rescue or a capture depends entirely on one's perspective. Creed was alive, preserved in stasis, theoretically recoverable if someone could find their way to Solemnace and convince or coerce Trazyn into releasing him. But he was also a prisoner, a specimen in an alien museum, separated from his people and his duty by forces beyond his control. His fate remains one of the great unresolved mysteries of the Cadian story, a thread left deliberately dangling, a possibility that keeps the flame of hope alive in the hearts of those who remember what the name Creed once meant. Colour Sergeant Jaren Kell was not so fortunate. Kell fell during the final battle, giving his life in defence of his Lord Castellan, as he had always sworn to do. The medallion crimson, which Kell had worn with such quiet pride, was lost with him in the death of Cadia. But his memory lived on in the hearts of every soldier who had ever served in the 8th Cadian, and in the broader legend of the Cadian shock troops, Kell's name became synonymous with loyalty, duty, and the willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice for something greater than oneself. There is something else I want to discuss before we move to the post-fall period, and that is the way the fall of Cadia affected the broader Imperium, not just militarily, but psychologically and spiritually. Because the destruction of Cadia was not merely the loss of a strategically important planet. It was the shattering of a symbol, and symbols matter in the Imperium of man in ways that would be difficult to overstate. For 10,000 years, Cadia had been the proof that the darkness could be held at bay. It was the example that generals cited when morale faltered on distant war zones. But it was the story that parents told their children to reassure them that the monsters in the night could be fought and beaten. When recruits on some backwater world complained that their training was too harsh or their situation too desperate, their sergeants would tell them about Cadia, about the people who lived on the very doorstep of damnation and never blinked, and the recruits would feel ashamed of their weakness and find new reserves of determination. Cadia was more than a fortress. It was an inspiration. When it fell, the psychological impact rippled across the entire Imperium. On world after world, soldiers and civilians alike received the news with stunned disbelief. Cadia could not fall. It had never fallen. It had stood for 10 millennia against everything that the Eye of Terror could throw at it. And the idea that it could be destroyed, that all those brave soldiers and all those mighty fortifications and all that accumulated expertise and tradition could be swept away in a matter of weeks, was genuinely incomprehensible to many. The fall of Cadia shook the faith of the Imperium in a way that few events in its history had ever managed. If Cadia could fall, then nothing was safe. If the line that had held for 10,000 years could be broken, then what defense could any world trust? The answer, of course, was that the defense remained the same as it had always been: the courage and determination of the men and women who stood on the wall. The destruction of Cadia did not invalidate the lessons the Cadians had taught. It reinforced them. The planet broke before the guard did. That was the truth that emerged from the ruins of the fortress world, and it was a truth that resonated more powerfully than any victory could have. The Cadians had been tested by the absolute worst that the forces of chaos could deploy against them, forces of such magnitude that they literally destroyed the planet itself, and they had not broken. They had fought to the last. They had held the line while others escaped. They had maintained their discipline and their courage in the face of annihilation, and they had done it all as ordinary human beings, and without the genetic enhancements of the Space Marines or the miraculous powers of the living saints. The surrounding worlds and star systems of the Cadian sector drew inspiration from this legacy. Had Cadia not been famous for holding so long against the odds, it is likely that many of the planets in the Cadian system would have capitulated or surrendered almost immediately when the Eye of Terror began to expand. Yet no normal world could be expected to stand in the face of the horrifying demonic armies that descended upon the Cadian Gate in such terrifying measure. But the wider systems of Cadia, Bellis Corona, and Agrippina stood fast. Perhaps, just as a veteran can lead lesser soldiers to deeds of great heroism, Cadia had inspired those worlds around it to defend every city and stronghold to the bitter end. The fortress world's legacy was not just its soldiers, it was the example it had set, and the standard of courage and defiance that other worlds now felt compelled to live up to. Let me also touch upon something that the Cadian experience reveals about the nature of the Imperium itself. The story of the Cadian shock troops is, in many ways, a story about the cost of survival in a universe that is fundamentally hostile to human existence. The Cadians sacrificed everything: their childhood innocence, their personal freedom, their chance at a life unconstrained by the demands of military service, so that the rest of the Imperium might survive. Their entire civilization was organized around a single purpose, and while that purpose was noble and necessary, it came at an enormous human cost. The children of Cadia did not choose to be soldiers. They were born into it, conscripted by the circumstances of their birth into a life of eternal war. They did not choose to grow up under a sky dominated by the Eye of Terror, yet to spend their childhood learning to kill before they could read, to know from their earliest memories that they were destined to face horrors that would drive most human beings mad. These things were imposed upon them by the necessities of survival, by the inescapable reality that someone had to stand on the edge of the abyss and hold it back, and that the people of Cadia were the ones who had been placed there by the cruel lottery of galactic geography. And yet, the Cadians did not resent their lot. They embraced it. They found meaning and purpose in the role that fate had assigned them. They took pride in their status as the galaxy's most capable soldiers. They loved their world, not despite its dangers, but in some ways because of them, because Cadia's proximity to the Eye of Terror gave their lives a clarity and intensity that few other human experiences could match. Every day on Cadia was lived with the awareness that it might be the last. And that awareness lent a vividness to existence that the comfortable citizens of safer worlds could never understand. This is what made the Cadians so compelling, not just as soldiers, but as people. They were human beings who had been placed in an impossible situation and had responded not with despair or resentment, but with defiance and purpose. They had taken the worst hand the galaxy could deal them and played it with a skill and courage that earned the admiration of an entire species. Yet they had stood where no one else would stand, fought what no one else would fight, and endured what no one else could endure. And they had done it all while remaining recognizably, beautifully, stubbornly human. That is the true meaning of the phrase, Cadia stands. It is not a denial of reality. It is not a refusal to accept the destruction of a planet. It is an affirmation of the human spirit, a declaration that the things that matter most about us, our courage, our loyalty, our determination, our refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming darkness, cannot be destroyed by any force in the universe, no matter how powerful. Worlds can be broken, cities can crumble, armies can be scattered, but the spirit that animated the defenders of Cadia, the spirit that burned in the violet eyes of every soldier who ever raised a lasgun in defense of the fortress world, that spirit is eternal. It cannot be killed. It cannot be corrupted. It cannot be extinguished. And that is why, even now, when the world itself is gone, Cadia stands. The destruction of Cadia was not just a military defeat. It was a cosmic catastrophe that reshaped the galaxy itself. With the pylon network destroyed and the Eye of Terror no longer held in check, the ancient warp rift began to expand at a terrifying rate. It merged with other warp storms and disturbances across the galaxy, growing and linking until it formed a single, as continuous tear in reality that stretched from one side of the Imperium to the other. This monstrous formation was given many names by the horrified populations that watched it bloom across the sky, but its official designation in Imperial records was the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift. The Great Rift effectively split the Imperium in two. On one side of the rift, in the region that came to be known as Imperium Sanctus, the light of the Astronomicon, was the psychic beacon on Terra that served as the primary navigational aid for warp travel, could still be perceived, however faintly. On the other side, in the vast and terrifying expanse called Imperium Nihilus, the Astronomicon was invisible, swallowed by the howling storms of the warp. Communication between the two halves of the Imperium became sporadic at best and impossible at worst. Travel across the Great Rift was extraordinarily dangerous, with only a handful of passages remaining viable and all of them fraught with peril. Worlds that had been secure members of the Imperium for thousands of years found themselves cut off, isolated, left to fend for themselves against threats that would have been challenging even with the full support of the Imperial military machine. The fall of Cadia had accomplished everything that Abaddon had spent 10,000 years working toward. The Cadian gate was broken, but the barrier between reality and the warp was torn asunder. The Imperium was divided, weakened, and struggling to survive. The Crimson Path was open, and the forces of chaos could now pour into the galaxy in numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy. For the Cadian people, the destruction of their homeworld was an event of almost incomprehensible trauma. Of the approximately 850 million people who had lived on Cadia at the start of the 13th Black Crusade, only a few million managed to escape during the frantic evacuation. The rest died, consumed by the expanding warp rift, or killed in the fighting that preceded the planet's death. Entire families, entire communities, entire traditions and customs and ways of life that had been maintained for thousands of years were annihilated in the space of hours. The survivors carried with them nothing but their weapons, their training, and their grief. But the Cadians did not break. They did not despair. They did not abandon the traditions that had defined them for 100 generations, or surrender the identity that had been forged in the crucible of eternal war. The planet Cadia was destroyed, yes. The fortress world that had stood as the shield of the Imperium for 10 millennia was gone, reduced to fragments of debris slowly being consumed by the expanding eye of terror. But the Cadian people endured. Their regiments, scattered across the galaxy in war zones spanning thousands of light years, all received the news of their homeworld's destruction and responded not with surrender, but with a cold, focused fury that made them even more dangerous than they had been before. The phrase that became their rallying cry, the words that every Cadian soldier spoke like a prayer and a promise combined, was simple and defiant. Cadia stands. On the surface, it might seem like denial, a refusal to accept the obvious reality that Cadia had fallen. But the Cadians understood the phrase differently. Cadia was never just a place to them. It was never just a planet. Cadia was an idea, a principle, a way of being. It was the belief that ordinary human beings, armed with nothing more than laser guns and determination, could stand against the darkest powers in the galaxy and refuse to yield. The planet could be destroyed. The chasms could crumble. The pylons could shatter. But the spirit that had animated the defenders of Cadia, as the courage and discipline and stubborn defiance that had held the line for 10,000 years, that spirit could not be killed by anything short of the death of the last Cadian to draw breath. And as long as even one Cadian remained alive, Cadia stood. The survivors of the fall gathered in the aftermath of the catastrophe and began the painful process of rebuilding their community in exile. Many found their way to the industrial world of Kairos in the neighboring Agrippina system, where they established a settlement they named New Cadia. It was not the same. No world could replace the fortress they had lost, the cases where they had grown up, the training grounds where they had learned to be soldiers, the view of the eye of terror swirling in the sky above their heads that had been a constant reminder of what they were fighting against. But it was a start, a place to gather, a place to begin again. The Cadian military machine, which had been the foundation of their civilization for millennia, adapted to the new reality with characteristic efficiency. Whole generations of Cadian shock troopers were now born, raised, and trained en route to war zones, their education conducted aboard transport ships and on staging worlds that bore no resemblance to the fortress cities of their ancestral home. The training was no less rigorous than it had been on Cadia. The standards were no less demanding. The traditions were maintained with a fierce devotion that bordered on the religious. Children still learned to handle laser guns before they could read. Mock battles were still fought with ruthless intensity. The Kasakans still branded the Caducade's sea eagle on the necks of those who earned it. But there was a change, subtle but significant, in the character of the Cadian regiments that formed in the years after the fall. As where the pre-fall Cadians had fought with the confidence of soldiers defending an impregnable fortress, the post-fall Cadians fought with the desperate ferocity of soldiers who had nothing left to lose. Their homeworld was gone. Their families were scattered or dead. Everything they had ever known had been taken from them by the forces of chaos. What remained was rage, cold and focused and channeled into military action with the precision that was the Cadian hallmark. But the post-fall Cadian regiments were, if anything, more dangerous than their predecessors, because they fought not just for the Imperium, but for vengeance. This transformation was embodied by the new Lord Castellan, who rose to lead the scattered Cadian forces. Her name was Ursula J. Creed, and she was the daughter of Ursarker E. Creed himself. Ursula's story was, in many ways, a mirror of her father's. She had been born from a brief relationship between the Lord Castellan and a chamberlain to a planetary governor. Growing up on Cadia, she had barely known her father, seeing him only twice from a distance throughout her childhood. Her mother had convinced Ursarkar to keep his distance, fearing that association with him would drag their daughter into the endless cycle of campaign and combat that consumed the Lord Castellan's life. Despite this separation, Ursula was a Cadian to her core. But she joined the 17th Cadian Regiment and built her own military career through talent and determination, rather than the reflected glory of her father's name. She was overseeing a garrison on the world of Hakeldama when the 13th Black Crusade struck, and she was among the millions of Cadians who survived the destruction of their homeworld. In the years that followed, Ursula rose through the ranks with a relentless determination that reminded those who had known her father of his own unstoppable ascent. She demanded swift redeployment after every victory, never resting, never allowing herself or her soldiers the luxury of complacency. She forged her own legend as a strategist of remarkable intuition and ruthless determination. When Ursula was eventually named the new Lord Castellan of Cadia, it was a decision that carried enormous symbolic weight. The creed name was synonymous with the defense of Cadia, and the fact that the daughter of the last Lord Castellan was now leading the scattered remnants of the Cadian military created a powerful sense of continuity. It was a statement that the line was unbroken, that the traditions endured, that the spirit of Cadia, embodied in the creed bloodline, still lived and still fought. As Ursula's appointment came with a mission that would have seemed impossible to anyone who did not understand the Cadian character. The Primarch Rabut Gilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, newly resurrected from 10,000 years of suspended animation, and now leading the massive Indomitus crusade to reclaim the galaxy from the forces of chaos, dispatched Ursula back to the shattered remains of Cadia itself. There, among the chaos-infested debris of her destroyed homeworld, she was to search for something her father had left behind. A data crystal containing his final battle plans, a contingency that Ursarkar Creed had prepared in case Cadia was lost. The mission was a nightmare. The remains of Cadia were a hellscape, fragments of a dead world floating in a region of space, saturated with warp energies, and crawling with the servants of the ruinous powers. Ursula and her team fought through horrors that would have broken lesser soldiers, facing the corrupted remnants of the world they had once called home, encountering the twisted fates of those who had been left behind when the evacuation failed. But they found what they were looking for. The data crystal contained information regarding the establishment of New Cadia, a plan for the preservation and continuation of the Cadian people and their military traditions. It was not a weapon, as many had hoped. It was something more valuable. It was a future. Ursula brought the data crystal to Gilliman, who recognized the value of what Ursarkar Creed had left behind. The plan for New Cadia represented more than just a new home for the Cadian survivors. It represented the continuation of a military tradition that the Imperium could not afford to lose. The Cadian shock troops were too valuable, too skilled, too effective to be allowed to fade into memory. The Imperium needed soldiers of Cadian quality now more than ever. But with the galaxy torn in half and enemies pressing in from every direction, the preservation of the Cadian military tradition was not just a matter of sentiment, it was a strategic necessity. Whether Gilliman ultimately approved the full implementation of Creed's plan remains a matter of ongoing narrative in the setting. What is certain is that the Cadian shock troops continue to serve across the galaxy, fighting with the same discipline and ferocity that made them legendary. But new recruits from other worlds who demonstrate the mettle to withstand Cadian training are inducted into their ranks, expanding the pool of Cadian soldiers beyond the diminishing number of biological descendants of the original Cadian population. The violet eyes that once marked every son and daughter of Cadia may eventually become rare among the ranks of the shock troops, but the traditions, the training, the standards, and the spirit remain unchanged. And Ursarkar Creed himself, the Lord Castellan, remains in the Gallery of Trazyn the Infinite on Solemnace, preserved in a tesseract labyrinth, frozen in time, neither alive nor dead, but existing in a state of suspension that the Necron considers the highest compliment he can pay. There are those within the Imperium who know of Creed's fate, who understand that the greatest tactical mind of his generation is not truly lost, but merely waiting, whether Creed will ever be freed, whether the Lord Castellan will one day return to lead his people again, is a question that has no answer in the present day. But the possibility exists, and for the scattered children of Cadia, that possibility is enough to keep a candle burning in the darkness. The legacy of the Cadian shock troops extends far beyond the battles they fought and the worlds they defended. Their influence on the military culture of the Imperium as a whole is incalculable. Our countless worlds across the galaxy base their own Imperial Guard regiments' equipment, organization, and methods of warfare on the Cadian model. The standard issue uniforms, equipment layouts, and tactical doctrines used by many Astra Militarum formations are descended directly from Cadian originals. When military planners on some distant world need a template for raising a new regiment, they reach for the Cadian standard because they know it works. It has been tested in the fires of 10,000 years of war against the worst enemies the galaxy can produce, and it has proven its worth beyond any reasonable doubt. The Cadian approach to training has been adopted, in whole or in part, by military organizations across the Imperium. The emphasis on discipline, marksmanship, teamwork, and mental toughness that characterized Cadian military education has become the gold standard against which other training programs are measured. Many worlds cannot replicate the full intensity of the Cadian system, which was the product of a unique combination of cultural factors and environmental pressures that cannot be artificially reproduced. But even a partial implementation of Cadian training methods produces soldiers of noticeably higher quality than those trained under less rigorous programs. Perhaps most significantly, the Cadians demonstrated something that has profound implications for every human being in the Imperium. But they showed that ordinary people, men and women without genetic enhancements or divine powers or arcane technology, could stand against the full fury of chaos and refuse to yield. The Space Marines are magnificent warriors, but they are superhuman, the product of millennia of genetic engineering and technological augmentation. The Sisters of Battle fight with miraculous power, but they are sustained by a faith so intense that it manifests as literal divine intervention. If the Cadians had none of these advantages, they were human, completely, ordinarily, stubbornly human. And they held the line for 10,000 years. That is the true legacy of the Cadian shock troops. Not their victories, though those were numerous and impressive. Not their defeats, though those were born with dignity and courage. Not their equipment, or their organization, or their tactical doctrines, though all of these were exemplary. What's the true legacy of the Cadians is the proof they provided that human beings, properly trained and motivated, armed with nothing more than mass-produced laser weapons and the will to fight, can face the very worst that the galaxy has to offer and remain standing. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the powers of hell press against the gates of reality, that proof is worth more than any weapon. It is worth more than any fortress, any fleet, any army. It is the proof that humanity is not helpless, that the darkness can be resisted, that the line can be held, not by demigods or saints or machines, but by ordinary people who choose, every single day, to stand up and fight. There is a phrase that echoes across the battlefields of the 42nd millennium, spoken by soldiers who may never have set foot on Cadia, who may not carry a single drop of Cadian blood in their veins, but who understand what the words mean and draw strength from them in their darkest hours. It is not a motto, it is not a battle cry, it is something deeper than that, something that touches the very core of what it means to be human in a universe that seems determined to destroy you. The planet broke before the Guard did. Think about that. The planet itself, a world of rock and metal and fire, could not withstand the forces arrayed against it. But the soldiers who stood upon its surface, the men and women who had been born and raised and trained to defend it, they did not break. Cadia shattered. The ground opened up and swallowed everything. The sky turned to fire, and the air itself became poison. And still the Cadians fought, still they held, still they refused to yield. The planet broke, but the Cadian shock troops did not. And that is why, even now, when the world of Cadia is nothing but rubble and memory, Yet when the casas have crumbled into dust and the pylons lie silent and shattered, when the eye of terror has expanded to become a wound across the face of the galaxy, the spirit of Cadia endures. It endures in every regiment that marches under the Cadian banner. It endures in every soldier who speaks the old words and feels the old fire kindle in their chest. It endures in the training grounds and the barracks and the trenches. Yet wherever men and women pick up laser guns and face the darkness with violet eyes, or no violet eyes at all, Cadia is not just a place. It never was. It was a promise. A promise that humanity would not go quietly into the night. A promise that for as long as there were soldiers willing to stand on the wall and face what was coming, the darkness would not have its victory. A promise that echoed across 10,000 years of war and continued to echo long after the world that gave it birth was gone. As the Cadian shock troops are the finest soldiers the Imperium of man has ever produced. They are the shield that guarded the realms of men. They are the proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to fight despite it. They are the embodiment of the idea that duty, discipline, and defiance can hold back the night, if only for a little while longer. And for as long as one Cadian draws breath, for as long as one soldier remembers the old training and the old ways and the old words, the line will hold, the guard will stand, and the darkness will not pass. Cadia stands. That is all for tonight's lore dive into the history and legacy of the Cadian shock troops. If you found this exploration of one of the most iconic military forces in all of science fiction as compelling as I did, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There is so much more of this incredible universe left to explore together, and I have many more stories to share with you. Whether it is the tales of other legendary regiments, the histories of the Space Marine chapters, the dark machinations of the Chaos gods, or the alien menaces that threaten humanity from every direction, there is always more to discover in the grim darkness of the far future. So subscribe, ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.